In the annals of Western history, few names inspired more terror in the hearts of outlaws than William "Deadeye" Durant. From the blood-soaked streets of Dodge City to the windswept plains of the Dakota Territory, Durant's reputation was written in gunsmoke and legend. They said he could shoot a man's gun from his hand at 50 paces, that he could draw faster than a rattler's strike, and that he'd sent more than 40 men to their graves in fair fights. But what made Durant truly dangerous wasn't his speed or accuracy. It was his patience. He was a hunter who could wait days for the perfect shot, a predator who studied his prey before striking. Then, in the spring of 1875, Deadeye Durant vanished without a trace. Some claimed he'd been killed in a nameless border town. Others swore he'd hung up his guns and headed east. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in between. But before we delve into the story of how the West's deadliest gunslinger found himself facing one last dance with violence, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow's tale about the ghost marshal of Lost Pine will chill you to the bone. Shadow Creek Valley, Montana Territory, 1878. The place had a quiet beauty about it, nestled between pine-covered mountains that caught the morning sun like God's own cathedral. It was the kind of valley that made men dream of putting down roots, of building something that would last. That's exactly what Thomas Miller had done 3 years ago when he bought the old Henderson place, 200 acres of prime bottom land with enough water to grow crops and raise cattle. To the folks of nearby Shadow Creek Town, Miller was everything a frontier farmer should be: hardworking, honest, and quiet. He paid his bills on time at Rebecca Hanson's general store, attended Sunday services though he rarely sang with the congregation, and politely declined invitations to social gatherings. If anyone noticed how his calloused hands seemed more suited to a gun belt than a plow, or how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon even while working his fields, they didn't mention it. Sheriff James Cooper, 20 years on the job and wise, in the ways of men, had his suspicions about Miller from the start. Two kinds of quiet men in this territory, he'd tell his deputy, young Billy Hawkins. Those born peaceful, and those who've seen enough violence to last a lifetime. Miller, he's the second kind. The sheriff's instincts weren't wrong. He'd seen how Miller positioned himself in crowded rooms, always with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door. He'd noticed how the farmer's right hand would sometimes drift to his hip, where a gun might have rested in another life. But Cooper was a practical man. Any man who worked his land honest and caused no trouble was welcome in Shadow Creek, regardless of his past. Dr. Sarah Collins was perhaps the only person who knew for certain that Thomas Miller was more than he seemed. She'd treated him for a bullet wound that first winter, an injury he claimed came from a hunting accident. The scar tissue she found told a different story, the kind written in lead and gunpowder across the years. But Sarah Collins understood discretion, and in the territories, everyone had a past they'd rather leave behind. Life in Shadow Creek Valley might have continued in its peaceful way, if not for the arrival of Marcus Kane and his gang. They rode. In one crisp autumn morning, 15 hard men with well-oiled guns and cold eyes. Kane himself cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black duster and a silver-trimmed gun belt that spoke of both wealth and the means by which it was acquired. The gang had earned a bloody reputation across 3 territories, robbing banks and freight offices with military precision. But it was their treatment of farmers and homesteaders that made them truly feared. Kane believed in leaving no witnesses, in making examples of those who resisted. The burned-out remains of homesteads marked their path west like cruel signposts. As Kane's men spread through Shadow Creek Town that morning, taking measure of its defenses and resources, none of them paid much attention to the quiet farmer driving his wagon down the main street. Thomas Miller nodded politely to the outlaws as he passed, his face betraying nothing as he noted their numbers and weapons. Only Sheriff Cooper, watching from his office porch, caught the subtle tension in Miller's shoulders, the coiling of a spring that had been waiting 3 years to unwind. The peace of Shadow Creek Valley was about to be shattered, and its humble, Farmer would soon be forced to answer a question that had haunted him for years. How long can a man run from who he truly is? Rebecca Hanson's general store served as Shadow Creek's unofficial gathering place, where news and whispers traveled faster than telegraph wires. The morning Kane's gang arrived, the store's usual friendly atmosphere had turned thick with tension. Through the front window, Rebecca watched Kane's men systematically moving through town, marking them with the keen eye of a woman who'd survived 20 years in frontier commerce. Two of Kane's men entered her store, one tall and lean with a snake tattoo crawling up his neck, the other shorter but built like a blacksmith's anvil. They ignored the welcome sign and headed straight for the ammunition display. Rebecca's hand drifted beneath the counter where her father's shotgun waited. Thomas Miller chose that moment to step through the door, carrying his usual supply list. If he noticed the tension in the room, his weathered face didn't show it. He nodded politely to Rebecca, then began selecting seeds from the agricultural supplies, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "Ain't seen stock like this since Denver," the tall outlaw commented, running his fingers over the Winchester ammunition. "Boss'll want to know about this." His eyes shifted to Rebecca. "Might want to discuss a new supply arrangement with you, ma'am." Miller's back was turned, but Rebecca noticed how he'd positioned himself, within arm's reach of both outlaws, his body angled slightly despite appearing focused on his shopping. It reminded her of a mountain lion she'd once seen. Perfectly, still yet coiled with potential energy. "Your boss is welcome to pay market price, like everyone else," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The shorter outlaw's laugh held no humor. Before he could respond, the store's door chimed again. Sheriff Cooper entered, his badge catching the morning light. The tension in the room ratcheted higher. "Gentlemen," Cooper nodded to the outlaws. "Miss Hanson, Mr. Miller." His hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Fine morning for shopping." The outlaws exchanged glances. They were professionals, not fools. 3-2 odds weren't worth risking their larger plans. They made their purchases without further comment and left, but not before the tall one gave Rebecca a look that promised future business. "Appreciate you stopping by, Sheriff," Rebecca said once they'd gone. Miller continued his shopping as if nothing had happened, but his selections now included extra ammunition for his hunting rifle. "Just doing my rounds," Cooper replied. But his eyes followed Miller's movements with curious intensity. "Though I'd be obliged, Mr. Miller, if you'd walk Miss Hanson home this evening. Never hurts to be neighborly in times like these." Miller paused, then nodded once. "Was heading to town anyway," he said softly. "Need to repair my plow at the blacksmith's." Outside, Marcus Kane had positioned himself in front of the bank, studying the building's architecture with the eye of a military engineer. His second-in-command, a former cavalry officer named Richards, approached with a report. "Town's got basic defenses," Richards murmured. "Sheriff's experienced, but only has 2 deputies. Most men here are farmers, ranchers. Shouldn't be any serious resistance." Kane's cold eyes swept the street, taking in every detail. "And our friend? Any sign?" Richards shook his head. "No trace of Durant. Trail's 3 years cold." "He's here," Kane insisted. "Man like that doesn't just vanish. Keep watching. Every town, every face." His hand unconsciously touched the scar on his left cheek, a permanent reminder of his last encounter with Deadeye Durant. In his office, Sheriff Cooper pulled out a worn wanted poster from his desk drawer. The sketch showed a younger man with hard eyes and a distinctive cavalry beard. The name beneath read William Deadeye Durant, with an impressive bounty listed. Cooper looked through his window at Miller's wagon rolling past, considering the weight of old suspicions and present dangers. The sun climbed higher over Shadow Creek Valley, and with it rose the certainty that blood would water the soil before these men left town. The only question was, whose blood would it be? Marcus Kane believed in careful planning. Violence, in his experience, worked best when precisely applied. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Shadow Creek's main street, He gathered his lieutenants in the back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The town's other patrons had quietly disappeared, leaving only the nervous bartender who kept his eyes fixed on his glasses while straining to hear their conversation. 3 days, Kane announced, spreading a rough map of the town across the table. First, we clean out the bank, then the payroll coming in on Friday's stage. By the time the cavalry responds, we'll be ghost smoke. His finger traced their escape route through the mountain passes. Any questions? Richards, the ex-cavalry officer, cleared his throat. Town's taking notice. Sheriff's more experienced than our usual marks. Let them notice, Kane replied, a cruel smile touching his lips. Fear works in our favor. Speaking of which, he turned to Snake Thompson, the tall outlaw from the general store. Tell me about our farming friend. The quiet one, Thompson shifted uncomfortably. Miller? Just another dirt farmer. But something about him. He paused, struggling to articulate what he'd sensed in the store. Way he moved, like a wolf trying to act like a sheep. Kane's eyes narrowed. Description? Tall, weathered, graying beard. Carries himself straight, military-like despite the farmer's stoop. Right-handed, but I noticed he can handle tools with his left too. The scar on Kane's cheek seemed to burn as old memories surfaced. Deadeye Durant had been ambidextrous too, a fact that had caught many men by surprise. Had made them dead with surprise. But Durant would be older now, grayer. Watch him, Kane ordered. Closely, but don't spook him. If it is who I think, we handle it my way. His hand drifted to the elaborate gun belt he wore, fingers tracing the notches carved there. 15 marks, with room for more. At his farm, Thomas Miller worked his fields with methodical precision, though his mind was far from agricultural concerns. He'd recognized Kane instantly. The man hadn't changed much in 3 years. The scar he'd left on Kane's face had healed ugly, which seemed fitting given its owner's soul. Sarah Collins, the town doctor, pulled her buggy up to his fence line. She often made house calls this way, checking on outlying farms, but today's visit had another purpose. Brought those medicines you asked about, she said loudly for the benefit of anyone watching, then added softly, and the bandages. Sheriff, Cooper suggested you might need them. Miller nodded, helping her down from the buggy. Best come inside. Getting late. In his kitchen, as she laid out clean bandages and surgical supplies, Sarah studied the man she'd come to consider a friend. That wound I treated 3 years back wasn't really a hunting accident, was it? Miller's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw past the farmer's facade to something harder, deadlier. No, ma'am. It wasn't. Kane's men are asking questions. About Deadeye Durant. About a shootout in Colorado Territory 3 years ago. She arranged her medical supplies with careful precision. They say Durant shot his way through 12 men that day. Left Kane with a scar and a thirst for revenge. 13, Miller corrected softly, then caught himself. According to the stories, Sarah's hands stilled. Thomas, whatever you're planning, you don't have to face it alone. The town, best you don't know more, Doc, he interrupted gently. Safer that way. But he accepted the medical supplies with a grateful nod. Though I'm hoping not to need these. As Sarah drove back to town, she noticed 2 of Kane's men watching Miller's farm from the cover of a distant ridgeline. The game of predator and prey was already underway, but she wondered if Kane's men realized they might not be the hunters they imagined themselves to be. In town, Sheriff Cooper was making preparations of his own. He'd sent his younger deputy to the nearest army post with an urgent message, while arming trusted townsmen with spare rifles. But as he watched the sun setting behind the mountains, he couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow Creek's best hope might lie in the quiet farmer, who never seemed to check his fences without his rifle close at hand. Night settled over Shadow Creek Valley like a wool blanket, bringing with it a deceptive peace. Kane's men had taken over the Silver Dollar Saloon, their raucous laughter spilling into the street along with the tinny notes of an out-of-tune piano. But behind the shut doors and drawn curtains of Shadow Creek's homes, fear crept in with the darkness. True to his word, Thomas Miller escorted Rebecca Hanson home from her store. They walked in comfortable silence, though Rebecca noticed how his eyes constantly scanned the shadows between buildings. Two of Kane's men followed at a discreet distance, making no effort to hide their presence. "They've been watching the store all day," Rebecca said softly. "The tall one, Snake, he came back again. Asked about Deadeye Durant. Said Kane's looking for him." Miller's stride didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "Durant's been gone 3 years. Long time to hold a grudge." Not long enough, apparently. Rebecca hesitated, then added, "They say Durant shot Kane's brother in that Colorado shootout, among others." "Kane's brother drew first," Miller replied automatically, then caught himself. "According to the stories." Rebecca stopped at her gate, studying her quiet companion. "You know more than stories, don't you, Thomas?" Before he could respond, hoofbeats approached from the darkness. Sheriff Cooper rode up, his face grim in the gathering dusk. "Evening, Miss Hanson. Miller." He dismounted, tying his horse to Rebecca's fence. "Mind if we step inside? Got some matters need discussing." Inside Rebecca's parlor, Cooper didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Army won't make it before Friday. Marshall's office is stretched thin with Indian troubles up north." He looked directly at Miller. "Kane's planning something big. Bank job, probably the payroll too. But that's not what really concerns me." Miller stood by the window, watching Kane's men in the street. "The shootout in Colorado," he said quietly. "That's what you're worried about." Cooper nodded. 13 men died that day, Kane's brother among them. Papers called it the Valentine's Day Massacre, on account of the date. He pulled out a folded newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. Witnesses said Durant was magnificent. Terrible, but magnificent. Took on Kane's whole gang when they tried to rob the bank. Saved a lot of innocent lives. And ended a lot of others, Miller added softly. Rebecca moved to her father's desk, unlocking a drawer. She withdrew a worn letter. "My father knew Durant before," she glanced at Miller. "Before he disappeared. Said he wasn't what the dime novels made him out to be. Said he was a man who hated violence, but excelled at it. A man who carried his skill like a curse." Outside, more of Kane's men rode past, their shadows dancing in the lamplight. Miller watched them with the calculating eye of a man measuring distances, noting weapons. "Town's got maybe 20 men could handle a rifle," Cooper continued, "against Kane's 15 seasoned killers. Unless—" He let the word hang in the air. "Unless what, Sheriff?" Miller's voice had changed, grown harder, more precise. "Unless Deadeye Durant isn't as gone as people think." Cooper's hand drifted to the wanted poster in his pocket. "Man like that, he might understand what Kane's planning. Might know how to stop it." A long silence filled the room. Finally, Miller spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Durant's dead. Had to die, so others could live in peace." He turned from the window and both Cooper and Rebecca saw something change in his eyes, a glimpse of the man he used to be. But maybe he left some things behind, things that might help. Such as, Cooper pressed, knowledge. About Kane's methods, about how he thinks. Miller's right hand flexed unconsciously, muscle memory from countless draws. About his weaknesses, Rebecca stepped closer to him. And if sharing that knowledge isn't enough? Miller's answer was interrupted by gunshots from the direction of the saloon, followed by screams. Cooper was already moving toward the door, gun drawn. "Looks like Kane's men are starting the party early." "No," Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. They're testing us, watching how the town responds. He picked up his hat, settling it with familiar precision. And tomorrow they'll start killing people. Dawn broke over Shadow Creek to find the town changed. The previous night's violence had left its mark. Broken windows at the saloon, bullet holes in the livery stable, and most telling, the body of young Tim Wesley, the blacksmith's apprentice, who'd made the mistake of talking back to Kane's drunken men. Doc Sarah Collins had done what she could, but the boy had died in the early hours, his master Henry Wesley holding his hand and crying silent tears. The killing changed everything. Fear gave way to anger, and anger had a way of making men either brave or foolish. Sheriff Cooper found himself dealing with both kinds as townsmen gathered outside his office, armed with everything from shotguns to ancient Civil War muskets. "We ought to rush them now," Henry Wesley argued, grief and rage making his voice shake, "before they kill anyone else." Cooper's response was cut short by the arrival of Thomas Miller's wagon. The farmer pulled up in front of the office, his manner calm despite the tension in the air. In his wagon bed lay several long wooden boxes. "Found these in my barn," Miller said quietly. "Previous owner must have left them." He pried open one box, revealing rows of carefully preserved Winchester rifles, their brass fittings gleaming in the morning light. "Thought they might be useful." Cooper examined one of the rifles. Military issue, well-maintained, with boxes of matching ammunition. The kind of cash a man like Durant might have hidden away for future need. The sheriff met Miller's eyes, understanding passing between them. Meanwhile, at the Silver Dollar Saloon, Marcus Kane was conducting business of his own. The killing of Tim Wesley hadn't been planned, but Kane was nothing if not adaptive. He sat at his usual table, watching his men's reflections in the bar mirror, while Snake Thompson made his report. "Town stirred up," Snake said. "Wesley was well liked. Sheriff's got men watching all approaches to the bank." Kane's fingers traced the scar on his cheek. "And Miller?" "Left his farm early, drove into town. Been watching him like you said." Snake hesitated. "Something else. Richards recognized one of his horses. Says it's got cavalry breeding, the kind Indian fighters used. Not the sort of mount a farmer would own." Kane's eyes narrowed. Durant was cavalry before he turned gunman. Served with distinction in the Apache Wars. He stood, buckling on his gun belt with deliberate care. "Time we paid our farming friend a visit. Bring 5 men, good ones." At the general store, Rebecca Hansen was helping Sarah Collins inventory medical supplies when she saw Kane's men riding toward Miller's farm. Her heart clenched with worry. She found Miller in the sheriff's office, discussing deployment of the newly discovered rifles. "Kane's men," she said without preamble. "Headed for your farm, 6 of them." Miller nodded, unsurprised. "Been expecting this." He looked at Cooper. "Best keep everyone in town. Whatever happens out there, best there's no witnesses." "You're not going alone," Cooper insisted. "Already am," Miller replied, his voice changing, becoming the whisper-soft tone that old-timers said Deadeye Durant used before violence erupted. "Kane's looking to confirm a suspicion. Let's not disappoint him." Sarah Collins stepped forward. "At least let me come part way. Set up at the Watson place. If there's shooting." Miller's refusal died at the determination in her eyes. He'd seen that look before, on field surgeons during the war. "Watson place," he agreed. "No closer." As Miller rode out, Cooper noticed how differently he sat his horse now. No longer the farmer's slouch, but the straight-backed posture of a cavalry veteran. Rebecca watched from the store window, remembering her father's words about Durant. He was the kind of man who could hide a wolf's nature behind a lamb's eyes until the wolf was needed. The morning sun climbed higher, promising another hot day in Shadow Creek Valley. But something colder was building, a storm of lead and blood that had been brewing for 3 years. Kane was about to discover if the quiet farmer was indeed the Tier, man who'd left him scarred and brotherless in Colorado, and Thomas Miller. He was about to learn if a man could return to the darkness just long enough to save the light he'd found without being consumed by it entirely. The Watson place sat empty, a half-mile from Miller's farm. Sarah Collins set up her medical supplies in the abandoned house while watching Kane's men approach Miller's property through her father's old field glasses. The riders spread out in a practiced pattern that spoke of military training, no doubt Richard's influence. Miller had reached his farm first, taking time to unsaddle his horse and begin his normal morning routine. If the approaching danger concerned him, his movements showed no sign of it. He was chopping wood when Kane's group rode up, each log split with the same methodical precision he applied to everything. "Mornin', gentlemen," Miller called, setting down his axe. "Something I can help you with?" Kane dismounted first, his silver-trimmed gun belt catching the morning sun. He studied Miller's farm with appreciative eyes. "Nice spread you've got here. Peaceful. Man could disappear here, start fresh." His hand casually rested on his holstered revolver. "Isn't that right, Durant?" Miller's face remained impassive. "Name's Miller. Thomas Miller." "Funny thing about names," Kane continued, walking. A slow circle around the woodpile. "They're like snakeskins. Man can shed them when they get too uncomfortable. But the man underneath, he doesn't change." Through her field glasses, Sarah could see Snake Thompson and the others spreading out, covering all angles. They were experienced manhunters, leaving no room for escape. Yet something about Miller's calm made her skin prickle with anticipation. 3 years ago, Kane's voice hardened. Valentine's Day. You remember that day, don't you? Miller? Read about it in the papers, Miller replied, his quiet voice carrying across the yard. Terrible business. Kane's laugh held no humor. Terrible business? That's what you call killing 13 men? What you call shooting my brother in the back? Your brother died facing me. Miller's voice changed, became harder, more precise, like the others. All facing the gun they chose to live by. The admission hung in the air like gun smoke. Kane's men tensed, hands drifting toward weapons. But Kane himself smiled, touching the scar on his cheek. I knew it, he said softly. The way you move, the way you watch everything. A man can change his name, his clothes, even his life. But he can't change what he is. Isn't that right, Deadeye? Miller, or Durant, straightened slightly, dropping the farmer's stoop he'd worn for 3 years. You've got business with me. Kane. These people, this town, they're not part of it. Everything's part of it, Kane snarled. You took my brother, my men, left me scarred and running. Everything you took, I'm going to take back. Starting with this farm, then the town. Then, I'm going to kill you slow, make you watch it all burn. No, Durant replied, his whisper-soft voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. You're not. Back at the Watson place, Sarah caught movement in her field glasses, sunlight reflecting off metal in Miller's barn. His preparations, she realized. Whatever was about to happen, he'd been ready for it. 6 guns against 1, Durant, Kane sneered. Even you can't beat those odds. Already did in Colorado. Durant's right hand hung loose at his side, inches from where his gun would have rode 3 years ago. Question is, Kane, how many of your men believe they'll be the ones to walk away? Kane's men shifted uneasily. They'd all heard the stories about Deadeye Durant, about his speed and accuracy. More importantly, they'd seen the Valentine's Day aftermath. Snake Thompson's hand trembled slightly on his gun belt. Only one way this ends, Kane declared, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Always is, Durant agreed softly. Question is, how many men have to die before we get there? His eyes swept the arranged killers. Ask yourselves, is dying for Kane's revenge worth never seeing another sunrise? The morning wind whispered through the yard, carrying the scent of fresh-cut wood and approaching violence. Sarah readied her. Medical supplies, knowing with grim certainty they'd soon be needed. In town, Sheriff Cooper and the others heard the distant sound of gunfire begin. and knew Shadow Creek's quiet farmer had finally shown his true face. What happened next would be talked about in Shadow Creek Valley for years to come. Later, Snake Thompson, who survived, would tell anyone who'd listen that it wasn't like normal gunplay. It was more like watching a force of nature, like trying to shoot lightning. The first move came from Kane, but Durant had been ready before the man's fingers even twitched. His right hand moved with impossible speed, not toward a gun, he wasn't wearing one, but toward the woodpile. The axe handle flew with deadly accuracy, catching Kane's draw hand with enough force to send his revolver spinning. In the same fluid motion, Durant rolled left as shots exploded from Kane's men. He came up behind the wagon, where Sarah could now see through her field glasses what Kane's men couldn't. A carefully positioned rifle, one of several Durant had placed around the yard during his morning chores. The first shot took down the rider on the far right, the bullet finding his shoulder with surgical precision. The second dropped Snake Thompson's horse from under him, sending the tall outlaw sprawling. All this in the space of 2 heartbeats. 3. "Years of peace," Durant called out, his voice carrying that deadly quiet tone. 3 years of trying to be something different. You should have let it lie, Kane. Kane had retrieved his gun with his left hand, ducking behind a water trough. "Kill him!" he screamed. "Kill the bastard!" Richards, the ex-cavalry officer, tried to coordinate a response, but Durant was always moving. A shot from the barn loft, where he'd somehow reached without being seen, caught Richards in the gun arm. Another from behind the well dropped 2 more of Kane's men, their shots going wild. "He's everywhere!" one of the remaining outlaws shouted, panic making his voice crack. "How's he moving so fast?" Through her field glasses, Sarah understood. Durant hadn't just prepared weapons, he'd orchestrated the entire battlefield. Every piece of cover, every angle, had been arranged over 3 years of quiet farming. The scattered farm equipment, the seemingly random placement of water barrels and wagons, all of it designed for this moment. Snake Thompson, nursing a bruised side from his fall, had seen enough. He dropped his gun, raising his hands. "I'm out," he shouted. "Not dying for this!" 2 more of Kane's men followed suit, throwing down their weapons. Durant's voice came from somewhere near the barn. "Slide those guns away and walk. Don't stop till you hit town." They didn't need to be told twice. Kane watched in fury as half his remaining force hurried away, leaving only himself, Richards, and 2 others, both looking like they wished they'd joined the retreat. "Durant!" Kane roared, firing blindly toward the barn. "Face me! 1 shot, 1 kill like real gunmen!" Real gunmen? Durant's whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Like in Colorado? 13 against 1 weren't fair enough odds for you." A shot rang out, and one of Kane's last men dropped his gun, clutching a bleeding hand. Richards, his right arm useless, tried to sight in on Durant's voice but found only empty air. The last unwounded rider decided to take his chances running, spurring his horse hard toward the road. "Your choice, Kane," Durant called. "Leave now, live to run again, or join your brother." Kane's response was a burst of gunfire toward every shadow, every possible hiding place. His shots kicked up dirt and splintered wood but hit nothing of substance. When his gun clicked empty, the morning fell deadly quiet. Sarah counted the seconds in heartbeats. 5, 10, 15. Durant emerged from behind the well, a rifle trained steadily on Kane. No one had seen him move there, even Sarah, watching. Through the field glasses, couldn't say when he'd made the transition. "Always wondered," Durant said softly, "if you were half the man your brother was. Now I know." The rifle cracked once, and Kane's gun hand exploded in pain as the weapon was shot from his grip. A second shot took Richards's revolver before the ex-cavalry officer could try a left-handed draw. "You can't do it," Kane snarled, cradling his bleeding hand. "Can't kill an unarmed man. The famous Deadeye Durant, too noble to shoot a man down." Durant's whisper carried the chill of mountain wind. "You're right. That's exactly why I had to stop being him." The rifle shifted slightly. "But you didn't let me stay stopped, did you?" Sarah Collins was already moving before the echoes of the last shot faded. As she drove her buggy toward Miller's farm, she still thought of him as Miller, she saw Sheriff Cooper and several townsmen riding hard from town, drawn by the gunfire. The morning air hung heavy with cordite and tension. She found Durant standing over Kane and Richards, his rifle unwavering. Both men clutched wounded hands, their faces masks of pain and fury. The yard looked like a battlefield, though she noted with professional appreciation that most of the wounds she could see were precise and non-fatal. "Went to a lot of trouble not to kill them," she commented, opening her medical bag. "Killings. Easy," Durant replied softly. "Living with it's the hard part." His eyes never left Kane as Sarah began treating the wounded. "Sheriff's coming. He'll want statements." Kane spat blood from where he'd bitten his cheek during his fall. "Statements? About what? How the famous Deadeye Durant's been hiding out as a farmer? How he ambushed honest men?" "Honest?" Durant's whisper carried an edge sharp as a razor. "Like you were honest in Colorado? Shooting up a town, killing innocents just to draw me out?" His rifle barrel dipped slightly. "Maybe I should be more honest. Now, finish what I started 3 years ago. Thomas." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm as she bandaged Kane's hand. "You're not that man anymore. You proved it today. All precise shots, no killing blows, even after what they did to Tim Wesley." Cooper rode up with his men, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. 2 of Kane's wounded men were sitting against the barn. Another lay groaning by the water trough, and Snake Thompson's tracks led toward town, along with 2 others who'd fled. "Quite a morning's work," the sheriff observed, dismounting. "Though I suspect Thomas Miller isn't the name you prefer, Mr. Durant." "Both names fit," Durant replied. "Depends on what's needed." "What's needed," Cooper said carefully, "is a legal resolution. Kane's wanted in 3 territories. Him and his men will face trial for Tim Wesley's murder." He paused. "Of course, that might stir up questions about other matters. Other names." Durant nodded, understanding the sheriff's meaning. His own wanted posters might be 3 years old, but they were still valid. "The law had a long memory." "Doesn't have to be complicated," Cooper continued. "Man defends his farm from outlaws. That's all anyone in town needs to know. Less said about past lives. Better for everyone." Kane's laugh was bitter. "You're deputizing." "Him? The great Deadeye Durant, tamed and collared?" "No." Durant's voice was quiet but carried clearly. "Not deputized, not tamed, just choosing something different." He looked at Sarah, then back at Kane. "But push this further. Make me choose between peace and protecting these people." He let the threat hang unfinished. Sarah finished bandaging, the last of the wounded as Cooper's men began securing prisoners. Durant finally lowered his rifle, the farmer's stoop returning to his shoulders like a comfortable old coat. "Town's changed," Cooper noted. "Kane's men who ran will talk. Word will spread about who you are, what happened here." "Already spreading." Rebecca Hanson's voice came from the road. She rode up on her father's old mare, concern evident on her face. 3 of them stopped at the store before running on. They were talkative. Durant absorbed this with his usual quiet. "Means others will come. Gunmen looking to make a name. Outlaws seeking revenge." "Let them come," Cooper said firmly. "Town's not defenseless anymore. Those rifles you found, the skills you've taught us these past years, we can handle trouble." Rebecca dismounted, moving to stand near Durant. "Unless you're planning to run again?" The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Durant looked at his farm, the crops he'd planted, the life he'd built. Then at the people around him. Sarah's steady gaze, Cooper's measured respect, Rebecca's quiet concern. "Running didn't work," he said finally. "Man can't escape what he is, but maybe—" He looked at Kane's defeated form. "Maybe he can choose how to use it." The morning sun climbed higher, drying the dew and the blood on Shadow Creek's soil. The immediate danger had passed, But all present knew this was just the beginning. The quiet farmer was gone, and while Thomas Miller might still tend his crops, Deadeye Durant's legend had awakened. The only question was, what kind of legend would it become? News travels fast in the territories, carried on horseback and whispered in saloons. By sunset of that bloody morning, the story had reached the railhead at Silver Springs. Deadeye Durant wasn't dead after all. Within days, the tale would spread. Across 3 territories, growing with each telling, how the legendary gunman had been living as a farmer, how he'd systematically dismantled Kane's entire gang without killing a soul, how Shadow Creek now had the deadliest gun in the West watching. Over it, the first vultures arrived within days. 2 young gunslingers from Kansas, barely old enough to grow proper beards, rode into town with more swagger than sense. They found Durant at Rebecca's store, helping her unload supplies. "Been looking for you, Durant," the taller one called out, his hand hovering near his gun. "Figure killing you would make quite a name for a man." Durant didn't even look up from the crate he was carrying. "You boys ever see a man shot?" His voice was soft, contemplative. "Not in the stories or stage shows. Really seen it? Smell of blood, sound they make when the bullet hits." The younger gunslinger's hand trembled slightly. Durant continued unloading supplies. "Way I see it," he said quietly, "you've got about 10 seconds to decide what kind of story you want told about this day. One where you wisely rode away, lived to get older and smarter. Or one that ends with you learning exactly why men feared my name." They chose to ride away, but not everyone would be so easily discouraged. In the Broken Spoke Saloon 2 towns over, Snake Thompson was holding court, his tale of the morning's events drawing a rapt audience, including 3 hard-faced men who listened with particular interest. 15 years riding with Kane's gang," Snake declared, nursing his whiskey. "Never seen anything like it. Wasn't just the shooting, though Lord knows that was something to see. It was how he'd planned it all. Every fence post, every water barrel, placed just so over 3 years, turned his whole farm into a trap." At a corner table, Jacob King Fisher absorbed every detail. He'd built his reputation robbing banks across the Dakotas, and he prided himself on careful planning. The idea of Durant's methodical preparation intrigued him professionally. Back in Shadow Creek, Durant found himself adjusting to his new reality. The townspeople treated him differently now, not with fear exactly, but with a curious mix of respect and cautious appreciation. Children who'd once helped him with his crops now peppered him with questions about his gunfighting days, until their parents hurriedly called them away. Sarah Collins found him on his porch that evening, cleaning his rifles with the same care he'd once shown his farming tools. "Saw 2 riders watching the farm from the ridge," she said without preamble. "Not the Kansas boys. These looked more serious." Durant nodded. "Been there since noon. Probably Fisher's men. He works with scout pairs, likes to study his targets." "The Awish King Fisher? The Dakota Territory bank robber?" "He'll come," Durant said softly. "Man like Fisher, he'll see Kane's failure as an opportunity to prove himself smarter." He inspected a rifles action. "Kane tried force. Fisher will try cunning." "The Cadiz town's worried," Sarah admitted. "Not about you, about what's coming. Kane's in the jail, but his gang's still out there, and now others are coming." "Town needs to be ready," Durant agreed. "Kane was right about one thing. Can't escape what I am. But maybe—" He paused, considering his words. "Maybe what I am is exactly what Shadow Creek needs right now." In town, Sheriff Cooper was dealing with his own complications. The territorial marshal had telegraphed, asking pointed questions about Durant's presence. Cooper's carefully worded response omitted certain details while emphasizing Durant's role in stopping Kane's gang. Rebecca Hansen closed her store late, having spent the day fielding questions from curious customers about her quiet farmer friend. She found Durant waiting to escort her home, a habit unchanged by recent events. "More riders came through today," she told him as they walked. "Looking for Deadeye Durant, looking for trouble." Found one, he replied softly. Best hope they're wise enough not to find the other. The setting sun painted Shadow Creek's buildings in shades of gold and shadow, but darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The legend of Deadeye Durant was alive again, drawing killers and glory seekers like moths to a flame. The quiet life of Thomas Miller was over, but perhaps something better could be built from its ashes. King Fisher wasn't a man who left anything to chance. From his temporary headquarters in the abandoned McAllister mine 3 miles outside Shadow Creek, he studied the detailed maps and notes his scouts had produced. Every building's location, every possible approach, even the daily routines of key townspeople had been carefully documented. Durant's changed their patterns, his chief scout, a former Pinkerton agent named Walsh, reported. Towns organizing watches, setting up firing positions, even got the women practicing with shotguns. Fisher nodded approvingly. Man's thorough. I'll give him that. Probably why Kane failed, tried to outshoot a shooter. He traced a line on the map. We'll do something different. In town, Durant was conducting his own preparations. He'd gathered the townsmen in the church, using its broad interior to demonstrate defensive tactics he'd learned during the Apache Wars. High ground's critical, he explained quietly, pointing to key positions. Bell Martin's boarding house commands the main street. General Store's roof covers the alley approaches. Watch in pairs, rotate every 4 hours to stay fresh. Henry Wesley, still grieving his apprentice but determined to protect the town, raised a practical question. What about the mining trails? Lots of old workings in those hills. Already covered, Cooper interjected. Durant's been setting up obstacles, trip lines, making sure any visitors take the routes we choose. Durant's quiet voice carried to every corner of the church. Fisher's different from Kane. Won't come in shooting. He'll try to outthink us, use leverage. His eyes met Rebecca's across the room. Which means everyone's at risk, not just those carrying guns. Sarah Collins arrived late, bringing news from her rounds. Spotted fresh tracks up by the old Carson place. 3, maybe 4 riders. Moving careful. Scouts, Durant confirmed. Fisher's style. He'll have men watching every approach, learning our habits. He turned to Cooper. How's our guest? Kane's not talking, the sheriff replied. But he's smiling more lately. Think he knows something's coming. The meeting continued as darkness fell, with Durant methodically addressing every aspect of the town's defense. The farmers and shopkeepers of Shadow Creek were learning to think like soldiers, and their quiet farmer was showing more of the tactical genius that had made Deadeye Durant legendary. Later that evening, Durant found Rebecca closing up her store. The street was empty except for the armed townsmen in their watching positions, visible only by the occasional glint of moonlight on rifle barrels. You should leave, he said without preamble. You and Sarah both. Fisher's coming and it won't be pretty. Rebecca continued her closing routine, checking windows and doors. My father built this store when Shadow Creek was just a few tents and dreams. Died defending it from raiders. She faced him squarely. I'm not leaving. Fisher will try to use you. All of you. Man like that, he sees connections, uses them as weapons. Like you saw them, she challenged. 3 years watching, planning, turning your farm into a fortress? Were we all just pieces in your tactical thinking? Durant was silent for a long moment. Started that way, he admitted finally. Chosen for defense, remote location, clear lines of sight. Town's layout, people's routines, all evaluated for strategic value. He looked away. Didn't expect to start caring. But you did. It wasn't a question. Shouldn't have. Caring makes you vulnerable, gets people killed. Also gives you something worth fighting for, Rebecca countered. She moved closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. Thomas Miller cared. Maybe that's what Deadeye Durant needs to remember. Their conversation was interrupted by the church bell. 3 quick rings, the signal for trouble. Cooper's voice carried. From the street. Rider coming in. Single man, carrying a white flag. Durant moved to the window, Rebecca beside him. The rider was making his way slowly down the main street, his horse's hooves echoing in the unusual quiet. By his bearing and fine clothes, he was no common messenger. Fisher himself, Durant whispered, coming to make his opening move. Awful confident, riding in alone at night. Durant's hand flexed unconsciously. Man like Fisher, confidence comes from knowing he's already set his pieces in motion. Question is, what's his game? The rider pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, the white flag ghostly in the moonlight. I'm here to speak with Mr. Durant, his cultured voice carried clearly, about a business proposition that could save a lot of lives, or end them, depending on his choice. Shadow Creek held its collective breath, waiting for Durant's response. The game was starting, and the stakes were already deadly high. King Fisher cut an impressive figure in the moonlight, his tailored suit and silver-handled Remington speaking of wealth earned through calculated violence. He remained mounted, though his hands stayed well away from his weapons. Around him, Shadow Creek's armed citizens watched from their positions, rifles gleaming dully in the darkness. Durant emerged from the shadows of Rebecca's store, moving with that fluid grace that spoke of his true nature. He stopped in the middle of the street, his voice carrying that deadly soft tone that old-timers remembered. Awful long ride just to talk business, Fisher. Fisher smiled, genuine appreciation in his expression. The famous whisper. You know, I heard stories about how Dead-Eye Durant could speak so quiet, men would lean in close just before they died. Always thought it was theatrical nonsense, but here you are. Here I am, Durant agreed softly. Question is, why are you? Professional. Curiosity, partly, Fisher admitted. Man in my position, I study success. What you did with Kane's gang, masterful. 3 years setting up your ground, preparing for every contingency. Beautiful work. Kane's in jail. His men are dead or running. That the kind of success you're looking to study? Fisher's laugh was cultured, elegant. Actually, it's the foundation of my proposition. See, I've studied this town too. Every approach, every building, every relationship. His eyes flickered to Rebecca in the store window. Every weakness. Durant's posture shifted slightly. A change so subtle only someone like Fisher would notice it. Making threats this early in the conversation. Not your usual style. Not threats, Mr. Durant. Context. Fisher adjusted his riding gloves. I have 30 men in position around Shadow Creek. Well-armed, well-trained. Not common thugs like Kane's crew, professionals. From his watching position, Cooper did quick mental calculations. 30 men, properly positioned, could lock down every escape route from town. Durant had clearly reached the same conclusion. Could be an interesting fight, Durant allowed. Could be a massacre, Fisher countered. But it doesn't have to be either. I'm offering a partnership. A murmur ran through the watching townspeople. Fisher continued, his voice reasonable and measured. Your planning, my resources. Think of what we could accomplish. Banks and railroads from here to Chicago wouldn't stand a chance. And if I decline? Fisher spread his hands. Then I demonstrate why I'm called king, starting with this town you've grown so fond of. His voice hardened slightly. I've got men watching the doctor's house, the store, the sheriff's family. One signal from me and you're positioned on the ridge lines, Durant interrupted, his whisper somehow cutting through Fisher's speech. 3 men by the old Carson place, 4 watching the eastern approaches, 2 teams in the mining trails, probably using the Thompson and McAllister claims as forward camps. Fisher's confident smile faltered slightly. You've been busy. Those mining trails you're using, Durant continued. Spent 3 years learning them. Every cave, every washout. Your men think they're watching us. Whole time we've been watching them. Sarah Collins stepped out of the doctor's office, rifle cradled professionally. Your watchers by my house left about an hour ago. Seems they had an unfortunate encounter with some rockfall. Eastern team's been sleeping peaceful since sunset, Henry Wesley added from his position. Amazing what a little knockout powder in their water source can do. Fisher's composure cracked slightly. You couldn't have found all. Already did. Durant's whisper was almost gentle. While you were studying us, we were dismantling your advantage, piece by piece. Man who plans 3 years ahead doesn't stop just because the first fight's over. Cooper stepped forward, his badge catching the moonlight. Way I see it, Mr. Fisher, you rode in here claiming 30 men. But I'm wondering how many are actually still able to back your play. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Fisher's hand twitched toward his gun, then stopped as he realized Durant had shifted slightly, ready for exactly that move. Interesting proposition, though, Durant said into the quiet. About partnerships. See, I've already got one, with this town. His whisper carried steel beneath its softness. Only difference is, my partners are still standing. Are yours? The night wind carried the faint sound of galloping horses in retreat. Shadow Creek held its breath, waiting to see how the king would respond to finding himself suddenly without his army. King Fisher had built his reputation on never losing control of a situation. Even now, with his carefully laid plans unraveling, his mind was already calculating new angles, fresh approaches. His pleasant smile never wavered. Impressive counterplay, he acknowledged. But you've overlooked something crucial, Mr. Durant. Something about men like us. No such thing as men like us, Durant replied softly. You're a predator. I'm trying to be something else. Fisher's laugh was sharp as breaking. Glass? Is that what you tell yourself? That you're reformed? Domesticated? His eyes swept the armed townspeople. Yet here you are, still playing chess with men's lives, still 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The only difference is the size of your territory. Rebecca watched from the store doorway, noting how Durant's posture had shifted subtly. She'd seen him make that same minute adjustment before the shooting started at his farm. You're right about one thing. Durant's whisper carried clearly in the tense night air. I am 3 moves ahead. That's how I know about the explosives your men planted while you kept us talking. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed Fisher's controlled features. From his position near the church, Henry Wesley called out, Found the charges, Mr. Durant. All 4 of them. Tom's disarming them now. Fisher's mask cracked slightly. How? You're not the only one who studies patterns, Durant cut in. You always wire your escape routes, 3 bank jobs in the Dakotas, all with the same signature. The charges, the diversion, the careful planning. His voice grew softer, more dangerous. All those witnesses you killed to keep your methods secret? They talked to marshals first. Marshals talked to me. You've been hunting me, Fisher realized. All along, even before Kane. That's why you chose this town, this valley. You knew we'd all come. Man spends 3 years planning, Cooper added from the boardwalk. He's usually got more than one target in mind. Fisher's composure finally broke. His hand dropped to his gun with snake-like speed, but Durant was already moving. The street erupted with the sound of multiple rifles being cocked. Don't, Durant warned, his whisper somehow carrying over the metallic clicks. You're better than Kane, smarter than most who've tried me. Don't die stupid. You think this ends here? Fisher's hand stayed near his gun. I've got friends in high places, connections you can't touch. I'll be out of jail before the ink dries on the arrest warrant. Maybe, Durant allowed. But you won't be king anymore, not after word spreads about how your perfect plan fell apart, how the famous Fisher got outmaneuvered by a farmer and a small town. Sarah Collins stepped forward, her rifle steady. You're men who weren't caught or running. They're watching right now, seeing their leader lose his crown. Fisher's eyes darted to the shadows between buildings, the darkened windows, the ridgelines beyond town. How many of his remaining men were indeed watching? How many were already questioning his leadership? Could still end this clean, Durant offered quietly. Surrender to the sheriff. Face trial for the bank jobs, but not the killings. Those charges might not stick without certain witnesses. Or, Fisher's voice was tight with suppressed rage, or test your speed against mine. See if you're faster than Kane's brother was, than any of the others were. The street fell deadly silent. Everyone knew Fisher's reputation with a gun. 5 men dead in documented duels, more rumored. But they also knew Durant's record and had seen him in action against Kane's gang. Rebecca found herself holding her breath. This was the moment that would define things, not just Fisher's choice, but Durant's response to it. Would the peaceful farmer or the legendary gunman prevail? Fisher's next words carried the weight of a man measuring his life's choices. They say you never drew first, that all your kills were fair. True, Durant whispered. But tonight's not about fair. Tonight's about finishing something that should have ended in the Dakotas. Your choice, how it finishes. The moon slipped behind a cloud, casting the street in deeper shadow. In the darkness, 2 killers faced each other, one clinging to his crown, the other trying to lay his own legend to rest. The only question was, which man would see the dawn? Time seemed to crystallize in Shadow Creek's moonlit street. Every witness would later recall the moment differently, yet all would agree on the stillness that fell, as if the very air was holding its breath. Even the nightbirds had gone quiet, sensing the approaching violence. Fisher's cultured facade had cracked completely, revealing the predator beneath. His eyes, once calculating, now held the desperate gleam of a man seeing his carefully built empire crumbling. His hand hovered near his silver-handled Remington, fingers twitching with nervous energy. You know what separates us, Durant? Fisher's voice had lost its smoothness. I admit what I am. You're still pretending. Not pretending, Durant replied softly. Choosing, like you're about to. Sarah Collins watched from her position, medical bag ready beside her rifle. She'd seen that look in men's eyes before, the moment when fear and pride mixed into a deadly cocktail. Rebecca Hanson had moved to the store's doorway, shotgun cradled in her arms, remembering her father's last stand in this same street. Could have been magnificent, Fisher continued, his words rushing out. Your planning, my connections. Instead, you choose to protect this. He gestured contemptuously at the town. This nothing place. These simple people. Simple? Henry Wesley's voice carried from near the church. Simple folks just dismantled your whole operation. What's that make you? Cooper raised his hand for silence, but the damage was done. Fisher's expression twisted at the mockery. His gun cleared leather with startling speed, but not aimed at Durant. The Remington swung toward Wesley's position. What happened next seemed impossible to follow with the naked eye. Durant's movement was fluid, eternal, instant, all at once. His first shot took Fisher's gun hand, sending the Remington spinning, away before it could fire. The second shot shattered Fisher's left hand as it reached for a hidden derringer. The third bullet struck the king's shoulder, spinning him half around. Impossible, Fisher gasped, staring at his ruined hands. Nobody's that fast. Wasn't speed, Durant's whisper carried clearly. Was certainty. You'd lost everything. Your men, your reputation, your future. Only question was who you'd try to take with you. Sarah rushed forward to tend Fisher's wounds, but Durant's gun remained trained on the fallen king. Careful, Doc. Man like him always has one last play. She nodded, remembering Kane's hidden boot knife. Her careful check revealed a small pepper-box pistol strapped to Fisher's ankle. Cooper collected it along with the other weapons. You knew, Fisher said through gritted teeth as Sarah worked. Knew I'd break. Knew I'd shoot wild. Knew you'd choose someone other than me, Durant corrected. Man like you, facing someone with my reputation, you'd try to prove yourself clever, try to change the game. His whisper held something like pity. That's why you'll never understand this place. Some things matter more than being clever. Rebecca approached carefully, her shotgun still ready. All these months, watching the town, learning our ways. Did You ever wonder why he stayed? Why he chose us? Fisher's laugh was pained and bitter. Chose you? He used you, like I would have. Just had different goals. No, Durant said quietly, finally lowering his gun. Took me 3 years to learn what you never could, Fisher. Some things you don't use. Some things you become part of. The B. Street was filling now with townspeople emerging from their defensive positions. They moved with newfound confidence, the pride of people who'd faced a threat and overcome it together. Cooper and his deputies began securing Fisher for transport to the jail. Won't hold me, Fisher warned, his old arrogance surfacing despite his wounds. My connections. Already handled, Cooper interrupted. Telegraph went out this morning. To every marshal and sheriff in 4 territories. Detailed accounts of your methods, your organization, your murders. Signed affidavits from witnesses you thought were dead. He smiled grimly. Turns out when Deadeye Durant spends 3 years preparing something he's mighty thorough. The night wind carried the sound of more horses approaching. Reinforcements from neighboring towns, drawn by Durant's carefully laid plans. Shadow Creek had faced its test and emerged stronger. But as Rebecca watched Durant holstering his gun, she saw the weight in his movements, the cost of returning to violence, even for a righteous cause. The question now was, could the man who'd so carefully orchestrated this justice return to being the quiet farmer? Or had the legend of Deadeye, Durant, truly come alive again? Dawn broke over Shadow Creek Valley with the promise of change. The morning stage brought U.S. Marshals to collect both Kane and Fisher, along with news that would reshape the territory. Fisher's connections were already falling, his network of corrupt officials and bought lawmen unraveling as evidence Durant had gathered over 3 years came to light. The quiet farmer's long game had reached further than anyone imagined. Every careful observation, every precise preparation hadn't just been about protecting Shadow Creek, it had been about dismantling an empire of corruption that stretched from Dakota to Colorado. You never were just hiding here, were you? Sarah, Collins asked, finding Durant on his porch that evening. The valley stretched before them, painted in sunset colors. Started that way, he admitted softly. Needed somewhere quiet, somewhere I could watch Fisher's operation without being seen. Somewhere I could plan. He looked at his fields, the crops he'd tended for 3 years. Didn't expect to find something worth staying for. In town, the mood was celebratory. The saloon had reopened, its piano playing more cheerful tunes. Rebecca Hanson's store had become an informal gathering place where people shared their parts of the story. How they'd helped watch Fisher's men, helped spring Durant's trap, helped protect their home. Town's changed, Cooper observed, sharing. Evening coffee with Durant in Rebecca's store after closing. Not just because they're not afraid anymore, because they proved themselves. They proved themselves long before this, Durant replied. Standing up to Kane, protecting their own. Fisher never understood that. Thought I was the only threat he had to plan for. Rebecca, arranging her ledgers, smiled slightly. And now? Will the famous Deadeye Durant ride off to find new wrongs to right? That's the question everyone's asking, a new voice added. Henry Wesley entered, carrying a telegram. Marshal's office has already offered you a badge. Governor's talking. About a special commission. Durant took the telegram but didn't open it. His eyes met Rebecca's across the store. 3 years ago, I chose this valley because it was tactically useful. Clear lines of sight, multiple escape routes, good defensive position. His voice softened. Now, Rebecca prompted. Now I'm choosing it for different reasons. Next morning, Durant rode to his farm as usual, but this time, he wasn't alone. Rebecca rode beside him, while Cooper and several townsmen followed with wagons loaded with lumber and supplies. The farm's defenses, so carefully crafted for war, would be rebuilt for peace. Sarah Collins reined her buggy alongside as they worked. Got word from the territorial prison, she announced. Fisher's talking. His whole organization's collapsing. They're calling it the biggest cleanup since the war. Good hunting, Wesley nodded to Durant. 3 years stalking your prey, Wasn't hunting, Durant corrected softly. Was building, something Fisher never learned. Sometimes the best way to destroy something wrong is to build something right. Tall. Summer sun climbed higher as they worked, transforming the fortress back into a farm. Young Tim Wesley's grave had fresh flowers, not just from his family now, but from the whole town. His sacrifice had helped forge something stronger than fear. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the valley, Durant stood at his fence line. Rebecca joined him, their shoulders touching comfortably. "More will come," she said quietly. "Other men looking to make their names." "Let them come," Durant whispered, but the deadly edge was gone from his voice. "They'll find more than one gun waiting, more than one person watching." He looked at the town in the distance, its windows twinkling, like earthbound stars. They'll find a home. The legend of Deadeye Durant didn't end that summer. But it changed, grew into something richer. Stories still spread across the territories, but now they told of a different kind of strength. Of a gunman who chose peace without surrendering his power to protect it. Of a town that stood up to evil together. Of a valley where justice and mercy walked hand in hand. And if you passed through Shadow Creek in the years that followed, you might see a farmer tending his fields, his lovely wife reading on the porch, and their neighbors working nearby. You might notice how his eyes still scanned the horizon out of habit, how his hands still moved with liquid grace. But you'd also see something that Fisher and Kane never understood. A man who had found something worth more than legend, more than revenge, more than power. He had found home. Just remember to subscribe to our channel, folks, and hit that notification bell, because tomorrow we've got another incredible tale from the West that you won't want to miss.